You're here for the insights, the stuff that really matters, so let's dive straight into a really crucial global issue today.
Okay.
That's the widening gap, income inequality across Asia.
Right. A huge topic.
Yeah, and we've pulled together quite a stack of research for this one. We're talking reports from the Asian Development Bank Institute, the IMF, Oxfam, plus, some sharp analysis from individual experts.
People like Bihong Huang, Peter J. Morgan,
Uh-huh.
folks with real backgrounds in economics and development.
Exactly. So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to pull out the most vital understanding of what's actually driving this divide.
And what the impacts are, right? The real-world consequences.
Yes, and potential ways forward. But, crucially, without getting totally swamped in data,
Good plan. It can get overwhelming fast.
Asia's our main focus, but we'll
Yeah.
probably glance at other regions too, just for, a bit of perspective.
Sounds good. Where should we kick things off?
Well, let's start with that big picture of growth.
Okay. Because what's really striking about Asia is just the sheer speed and scale of economic growth in many countries.
Yeah, like the PRC, India, especially from the 80s onwards, their average incomes just shot up.
They really did. And your first thought might be, great, everyone's better off. And, well, it did lift a lot of people out of absolute poverty.
But that's not the whole story, is it?
No, not at all. The crucial point, the one that often gets missed, is that the benefits of this amazing growth, they haven't been shared equally, not by a long shot.
Right. And the numbers really back that up. I mean, the IMF tracked India's Gini coefficient.
Uh-huh. The standard measure of inequality.
Yeah, 0 is perfect equality, 100 is one person gets everything. And India's went from 45 in 1990 up to 51 by 2013.
That's a noticeable jump.
It is. And what I found interesting in the research is that this gap isn't just, the classic city versus countryside thing.
Which I'd expect, yeah.
It's increasingly happening within the cities themselves. It's more complex.
Absolutely. And this rise in inequality, it's not happening in a vacuum. The research points to this whole mix of powerful global forces at play.
Like what?
Well, you've got globalization, obviously. Big impacts on jobs, trade.
Okay.
Then there's technology. Technological change is relentless, right? It brings huge benefits, sure, but it can also really favor people with certain skills or in certain industries.
Leaving others behind, potentially.
Potentially, yes. Then financial development. Financial markets growing. Essential for a modern economy. But they can also amplify existing inequalities if not managed well.
Mm-hmm.
And even things like demographic shifts, changes in the age structure of the population, they all play a part. It's like a complex machine.
So that's the big picture. Rising inequality, multiple drivers. But what does that actually, feel like for people? What are the impacts on the ground?
Right, because it's more than just numbers. One really fascinating thing the research brings up is this idea of conspicuous consumption.
Okay, spending to show off, basically.
Sort of, yeah. In societies with bigger income gaps, people with lower incomes might feel this stronger pressure to spend on luxury goods, not because they need them, but to signal a higher status.
Trying to keep up or appear to keep up.
Exactly. But that can lead to economic problems for individuals, and it also has potentially significant environmental costs, right? Resources going to non-essentials.
That's a really interesting angle, this sort of societal pressure. And it goes beyond just buying things, doesn't it? I think I read something about health impacts, too.
You're spot on.
Yeah.
There's a pretty troubling link emerging between inequality and really basic stuff like nutrition.
How so?
Some research has found a connection.
Mhm.
Countries with higher income inequality also tend to have a higher proportion of obese people.
Wow.
It suggests inequality can have these really deep, far-reaching effects on public health. It raises questions about, access to healthy food, maybe stress levels.
Yeah, the psychological impact of living in that kind of society.
Exactly. It's
Okay.
complex, but the link seems to be there.
Okay, so we're seeing the what, some potential whys, and the real-world consequences. Now, you mentioned the Gini coefficient earlier. When researchers actually measure inequality, there are quite a few different tools they use, right?
Oh yeah, there's a whole toolkit. Different measures capture different aspects of the problem.
Can you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. So you have things like the squared poverty gap. That one really focuses on the folks furthest below the poverty line. It measures the depth, the severity of their poverty.
Okay, so focused on the very poorest.
Right. Then there's the Watts index.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's more sensitive to income changes right at the bottom. So a small gain for a very poor household counts more in a way.
Distribution sensitive.
Exactly. Then the Gini coefficient, like we said, gives that overall snapshot of the entire distribution.
The most common one you hear about.
Probably, yeah.
Hmm.
The mean log deviation, or MLD index, is another one that's particularly sensitive to what's happening at the lower end. A simpler one is the decile ratio. That just compares the income of the richest 10% to the poorest 10%. Pretty straightforward.
Rich versus poor, clear cut.
Yeah. And then if you want to look at change over time, you can use dynamic measures. These compare how the incomes of the poorest groups are growing compared to the average, or compared to the richest groups.
To see who's benefiting most from growth.
Precisely. Are the gains widely shared or concentrated at the top?
That's really helpful. Different lenses for different questions. It's not just one number. And I think the research used Senegal as an example to show these in action.
It did, yes. There's a table 3.1, looking at Senegal from 1994 to 2011. You'd see how some indicators moved.
What did it show?
Well, the squared poverty gap and the Watts index, those generally went down over the period.
Yeah.
Which is good news, suggests the depth and severity of poverty decreased.
Okay.
But the Gini coefficient and the MLD index, they sort of fluctuated more. Like the Gini dipped in the mid-2000s, but then ticked up again by 2011.
So while extreme poverty might have lessened, the overall distribution was still shifting around.
Exactly. It hints that maybe some groups were benefiting more than others, even as the worst poverty eased.
And Senegal's economic growth wasn't exactly smooth sailing during that time either, was it?
No, it had its ups and downs. In the late 90s, early 2000s, they had pretty decent growth, around 5% GDP growth a year. And poverty fell significantly then.
Okay, growth correlating with poverty reduction.
Yes. Then growth slowed a bit in the early to mid-2000s, but poverty kept falling, just not as fast.
Still moving in the right direction.
But then from about 2005 onwards, they hit various economic headwinds, growth really slowed down, and poverty reduction basically stalled. Much smaller drop.
That really hammers home the point, doesn't it? Growth matters, but how it's distributed is key.
Absolutely critical. And the research showed, for instance, looking at growth patterns in Dakar, the capital. Lower income groups didn't see their incomes rise as much as middle and higher income groups.
Which could widen inequality within the city.
Right. And if you look at the comparative figures across Africa around that time, Senegal made progress, sure, but its poverty rate was still relatively high compared to some neighbors, and the pace of reduction really varied depending on the growth rate.
So let's take those lessons from Senegal and elsewhere and bring it back to Asia. What are the big takeaways for policymakers who want growth that actually includes more people?
Well, the research really bangs the drum on a couple of fundamental points. First, obviously, you need sustained overall economic growth. It's like a prerequisite.
Can't share the pie if the pie isn't growing.
Pretty much. Studies consistently link growth in average income to poverty reduction. One estimate mentioned was a 1% rise in real per capita income, leading to maybe a 2% drop in the poverty headcount ratio.
So job one is creating the conditions for growth.
Right. Senegal's experience confirms that faster poverty reduction happened when growth was higher.
Okay, makes sense. But the second lesson seems just as important, maybe more so, how the benefits get shared out.
Precisely. This is crucial. If inequality shoots up while the economy grows, it can completely cancel out the poverty-reducing effect of that growth.
So growth happens, but the poorest don't benefit.
Exactly. Some analysis suggested maybe 2/3 of poverty reduction comes from just the average income going up, but the other third comes from inequality decreasing.
That's a big chunk tied to distribution.
It is. And here's a striking statistic. A 1% income increase in a highly unequal country might only reduce poverty by about 0.6%, but in a highly equal country, that same 1% growth could cut poverty by over 4%.
Wow, that's a massive difference.
Huge. It just underscores how vital it is to think about both the size and the distribution of the pie. But there's a caveat.
Which
Policies aimed only at inclusivity, if they're badly designed, could actually end up hurting overall economic growth. So finding that right balance is really key.
tricky. And within that, agriculture seems to pop up again and again as really important for inclusive growth, especially in Asia.
Absolutely. A strong farming sector is consistently flagged as being really significant for inclusiveness.
Why is that?
Well, mainly because it directly impacts the livelihoods and the spending power of a huge proportion of the poor in many low and middle income Asian countries. When agriculture does well, the benefits tend to trickle down more effectively, you could say.
Okay, so what kinds of policies actually help boost agriculture and make it more inclusive? What works?
The research points to several things that have worked elsewhere. Improving farmers' access to markets is a big one, making it easier and cheaper for them to sell their produce.
Reducing barriers.
Yeah. Strengthening land rights so farmers feel secure enough to invest. Creating a generally supportive environment for all farmers, not just large ones.
Leveling the playing field a bit.
Kinda. Huh? Also, expanding access to better technology for smallholders and helping poorer farmers manage risks, like bad weather or price swings.
Makes sense. What about non-farm jobs?
Also crucial. Key policies there include improving the overall investment climate to attract businesses that create jobs.
Making it easier to start and run a business.
Right. Expanding access to good quality secondary education, especially for girls, is vital for future jobs.
Education again.
Always. Plus, designing labor market rules that encourage job creation while still protecting workers. And investing in basic infrastructure roads, power. That helps everyone.
And one last piece seems to be the financial system, making sure it works for the poor, too.
Exactly. Deepening the financial sector, but specifically making sure the poor can access services. This can really boost inclusiveness.
How so?
Well, studies show that more financial development often leads to higher incomes for the poorest. If people can't access credit or savings accounts, they can't easily invest in education or start a small business.
Trapping them in poverty.
It can, yes.
Yeah.
Becomes a major barrier, perpetuating inequality. So things like expanding microfinance, rural banking, better credit information systems, they can all make a real difference.
Okay, that gives a good sense of the policy levers. Now, let's maybe zoom in again. You mentioned inequality within countries. How does it look across different groups in Asia?
Yeah, the research digs into this, looking at income gaps based on things like rural versus urban location,
Okay.
the specific region within a country, the education level of the household head, your job situation, and also the gender of the household head.
So slicing the data in different ways.
Right, using some pretty advanced statistical methods to see how these differences play out across the whole income spectrum, not just on average.
And what were some of the standout patterns? What really jumped out?
One of the most consistent findings across the economies, they looked at PRC, India, Japan, Korea, but also Russia and Taipei, China, was the big income difference linked to education.
Not surprising, maybe, but significant.
Very. And interestingly, these education-related gaps were particularly wide in India and the PRC.
Why might that be?
Well, it could suggest a bigger economic divide between skilled and less skilled workers in those rapidly developing economies. Skilled jobs often concentrate in cities.
Well, rural areas might have less access to good education.
Exactly, potentially leading to lower earning potential and widening that gap. The gaps were smaller in places like Japan, interestingly.
Education is just so fundamental. What about the gender gap? That's always a big concern.
Yeah, the analysis found some worrying signs there too. In Taipei, China, for instance, female-headed households actually saw their relative income decline over the period studied.
Decline? Why?
It seemed to be down to two things. First, less access to income-generating assets and opportunities like education, good jobs, what they call the endowment effect.
Okay.
And second, even for the assets they did have, they got a lower return on them compared to men, the returns effect.
So disadvantage in getting opportunities and getting less reward for the opportunities they do have.
That's what it suggests. It points towards potential disadvantages in the job market, maybe discrimination, and highlights a real need for policies to support female-headed households.
Right. Okay, shifting gears slightly, the research also looked at the macro level, didn't it? How things like overall GDP growth, inflation, unemployment affect inequality in Asia.
Yes, they try to untangle those relationships using dynamic panel data analysis. Basically, sophisticated stats to handle the fact that all these things influence each other.
And what did that show? Does simple GDP growth reduce inequality?
It's nuanced. The findings suggested that the initial phases of GDP growth might actually benefit middle and upper income groups more.
So inequality could even widen at first.
It could, but, and this is important, sustained growth over the longer term, especially if it comes alongside better education levels across the population, tends to be more redistributive.
How so?
It seems to shift income away from the very richest towards the middle and lower groups over time. So long-term educated growth seems better for equality.
That's an interesting dynamic. What about inflation and unemployment? How do they fit in?
They have different effects. Generally, higher inflation seems to reduce the income share of the richest.
Really? Why?
Possibly because the value of financial assets held by the rich might not keep pace with rising prices, as well as, say, wages or the cost of goods consumed by poorer households adjust. It's complex, though.
Okay. And unemployment.
Unemployment tended to hit almost everyone's income share, except the very richest. The biggest negative impact was felt by lower and middle-income groups.
So unemployment hits the non-rich hardest. Makes sense.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, let's dig even deeper now into some specific drivers. What about education and globalization together, specifically in the Asia-Pacific?
Right, there was analysis focused just on that interplay. They used something called the Education Gini Index.
Like the income Gini, but for education.
Exactly. Measures inequality in educational attainment. And they found, generally, as average years of schooling went up in a country, this education inequality tended to go down.
Which seems logical. More schooling overall, potentially more evenly spread.
Right. Then they looked at how average education inequality, plus measures of economic and political freedom and globalization, all related to income inequality. The findings really highlighted education. Higher average education levels and more equal access to education were strongly linked to lower overall income inequality.
So education promotes equality.
And a bigger slice of the pie for the poorest, 40%, yeah. Globalization's impact was a bit more mixed, sometimes linked to higher inequality,
Right.
depending on the country and how you measure it.
Always complicated, globalization.
It really is.
Now let's talk about the middle class, often seen as this engine of growth and stability. How does the research view the growing middle class in developing Asia?
It's definitely a focus. But first, defining the middle class in developing countries is tricky.
How do they approach it?
They looked at different ways.
Mm,
Just the sheer number of people in a certain income bracket, or their total economic weight, like their share of total spending.
okay.
And they also broke it down into tiers. You have the floating class just above poverty, still vulnerable, then lower middle, upper middle, higher middle.
Different layers.
Yeah. And what's really striking is a huge gap in average consumption between the middle class in, say, Europe or the U.S. and the middle class in developing Asia.
So middle class doesn't mean the same thing everywhere in terms of spending power.
Not at all. And the research suggests that for driving economic growth, especially in middle-income countries, it might be the wealth or average consumption level of the middle class that matters more than just how many people fall into that category.
Interesting. A smaller but more financially secure middle class might have more economic clout than a larger but more precarious one.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Quality over just quantity, perhaps.
Now, the research also brought up looking at growth intertemporally, over time, considering income mobility. Why is that angle important?
It's about getting beyond static snapshots. Traditional measures of pro-poor growth are often anonymous, meaning they look at the income distribution at time A and time B and see if the share going to the poor increased, but they don't track individual people.
So you don't know if the same people who are poor at time A are the ones better off at time B.
Exactly. Some poor people might have escaped poverty, sure, but others might have fallen into poverty. Some might have moved up, some down. Anonymous measures miss that churning.
So the non-anonymous approach tracks individuals.
Yes, it focuses on income mobility. Are the same individuals who were poor actually seeing their incomes rise over time?
And they used Indonesia as a case study for this.
They did. Looking at household data from 1997 to 2007, they managed to split pro-poor growth into two bits. The anonymous part, overall distribution change, and a mobility part, how individuals moved within the distribution.
What did they find?
They found that in Indonesia during that specific period, changes in people's relative income rank mobility played a really significant role in the overall pro-poor growth picture. It wasn't just about the tide lifting all boats equally.
Mobility matters, people moving up or down the ladder.
Right.
Staying with Indonesia, the research also looked at spatial inequality geographical differences during its decentralization period. What did that show?
Yeah, this looked at expenditure inequality across different areas between 1996 and 2010, a time of big political shifts towards local control.
How did they measure it geographically?
They used a tool called the Thiel Index Decomposition. It lets you break down total inequality into chunks. Inequality between urban and rural, then among districts, among provinces, among larger regions.
Peeling the onion of inequality layers.
Kind of, yeah. And a key finding was that inequality within individual districts was actually a huge driver of the overall national inequality.
So disparities within local areas were really significant.
Especially during periods of economic shocks, like when oil prices shot up or fuel subsidies were changed. Those hit different people within the same district very differently.
And they saw different trends in urban versus rural areas, too.
Yes. Urban and rural inequality didn't always move in the same direction, and policy changes, like cutting fuel subsidies but providing compensation packages, had noticeable, sometimes contrasting impacts in different places.
It really highlights how national averages can hide a lot of local variation.
Absolutely. Location matters immensely.
And digging deeper into Indonesia, what factors did they identify as actually contributing to income inequality there?
Using regression-based decomposition on household survey data, they pinpointed several key factors.
Such as?
Things like the gender of the household head, again, age of the head, household size, education levels, household wealth.
The usual suspects, perhaps?
Many of them, yes. Also, their proportion of wage earners in the household, and crucially, whether the household was in a rural area or in the generally less developed eastern part of Indonesia.
Location again.
Yes. And interestingly, the relative importance of these different factors in explaining inequality actually changed over time. It wasn't static.
Reflecting how the economy and society were evolving.
Exactly.
Okay, let's shift focus one more time to Vietnam. The research looked at mobility there too, both within a person's lifetime and across generations.
That's right. Analyzing income and employment mobility.
What did they find about people moving between jobs or income levels?
They used household survey data to track movement, both upward and downward mobility across different kinds of jobs. Unskilled, skilled, non-manual, self-employed wage jobs, and also between farming and non-farming sectors.
So quite detailed tracking.
Yes, and they found, as you'd expect, patterns of both upward and downward movement. Factors like education level, ethnicity, and where someone lived geographically were significant influences on who moved up or down.
Education, ethnicity, location,
Yeah.
recurring themes.
Definitely. And they also estimated intergenerational earnings elasticity,
Which is?
basically a measure of how strongly a child's earnings are linked to their parents' earnings. High elasticity means less mobility. Your parents' income heavily predicts yours.
What did they find in Vietnam?
They found the link was stronger, meaning less mobility for people in rural areas and for ethnic minorities. It was weaker for those with higher education levels.
So again, education seems to be a key pathway for breaking that intergenerational cycle and boosting mobility.
It really appears that way from the data.
Okay, and just to wrap up the specific country examples, the research also touched briefly on foreign direct investment FDI in the PRC and its impact on wages.
Yes, looking at the wage gap between foreign-owned firms and domestic ones. The general finding was that FDI seemed to have a positive impact on overall wage levels in the PRC. Companies with foreign capital tended to pay higher wages than purely domestic ones.
Okay.
They also looked at how that specific wage gap changed over time, suggesting a dynamic effect.
And finally, the shift away from agriculture in rural China.
Yeah, looking at how that massive transformation from traditional farming to a modern, non-agricultural rural economy affected income inequality within rural areas.
Well, now they analyze that.
By breaking down rural income inequality into different sources.
Yeah.
Income from farming, income from non-farm jobs or businesses, and income from transfers, like government payments.
Oh.
And they showed how the contribution of each of these sources to overall rural inequality changed over time in different regions, like Tianjin and Shandong, highlighting again how complex these development processes are in terms of distributing the benefits.
Right. It's never a simple story. Wow. Okay. That was a really comprehensive run-through. A lot to digest there. So if we try to pull together the main threads from this deep dive into inequality in Asia, what are the absolute key takeaways?
Well, firstly, it's crystal clear that income inequality in Asia is incredibly complex. It's not one thing. It's driven by this whole web of interconnected factors: globalization, tech, policy choices, demographics.
No single silver bullet.
Definitely not. Second, while economic growth is absolutely essential, you need that foundation. How the benefits of that growth are distributed is just as important, maybe even more so, for actually reducing poverty and improving overall well-being.
Growth alone isn't enough. It has to be inclusive growth.
Precisely, which leads to the third point. Policies matter.
Yeah.
Specifically, policies focusing on boosting access to quality education, supporting agriculture, promoting financial inclusion for the poor, and tackling those geographical disparities we talked about. Those seem crucial for making growth more inclusive.
Targeted interventions.
Yes. And finally, to really understand what's going on with inequality, we have to look beyond just the headline numbers, the national averages.
Dig deeper.
Yeah. Consider the different experiences of various groups by education, gender, location. Look at disparities within regions, not just between them. and track how things change for individuals and families over time, that mobility piece is key.
It's a multi-layered dynamic picture.
Very much so.
Okay. And with all that in mind, maybe a final thought for you, our listener. As we've unpacked Asia's complex experiences with rising income inequality, how might these insights apply elsewhere? Or how might they shape your own understanding of economic development, social equity, in our incredibly connected world today?
Good question to ponder.
Definitely plenty more to explore, whether it's specific countries, the ever-evolving role of technology, or maybe the crucial function of social safety nets in cushioning some of these impacts. But for now, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.